Today we are going to be looking at lesson 9.3, which is still solving quadratic equations. However, today we are going to solve quadratic equations using the square root method. So let's review what a quadratic equation is. It's going to be an equation that can be written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where a does not equal 0. Okay, what I have there, this is called standard form. So all of the terms are together on one side. You have to have a squared term, which is why a cannot be 0. However, b could be 0 or c could be 0, just a could not because I want that squared term. But when everything's to one side and that equation equals 0, we call that standard form. So today we are going to be solving quadratic equations where the b equals 0. So in other words, we're going to solve a quadratic equation that looks like ax squared plus c equals 0. Okay, so notice that there's an x squared term, but because b equals 0, the x term has disappeared. So solving quadratic equations, we are going to write the solutions as integers if possible. Excuse me. Otherwise, we're going to leave them in radical form. Okay, and by radical form, I mean there's going to be a square root involved. Okay, so let's start solving. When we have something like x squared equals 16, now notice that this time it doesn't say equals 0. The number has moved to the other side. That's actually how we want it. I want the x squared term isolated by itself. So I want no number on the same side as the squared term. So right now we're good to go. So when that's the case, this method is called the square root method because how we're going to get rid of the square, because really I just wanted to say x equals, is we are going to then take the square root of both sides. So when I take the square root on the left, what happens is that the square and the square root cancel. It's kind of like addition and subtraction cancel each other out, or multiplication and division cancel each other out, while a square and a square root cancel each other out. So then that leaves you with the x by itself. Now, if you do the square root on the left, you have to balance out the equation, so you have to do it on the right. So when you take the square root of 16, there's a couple different ways for you to go about doing that. You can use a calculator. So let me show you the calculator. Okay, if you don't have a calculator that you can use in your hand, then you can always go to that Desmos Scientific Calculator on the Schoology webpage that I have for you. Notice that there is a square root button over here on the far left. So let's see how we do this because some calculators are different. So sometimes you hit the square root button first. Okay, so in this case I do. And then the number was 16. So I'm going to type 16 underneath. And notice that it gives me an answer. It gives me an answer of 4. So I'm going to go back to my screen. I know that x is going to equal 4. Now, here's the thing, though, that the calculator doesn't do, but we need to be aware of. Because the problem started with a squared term, that exponent tells us how many answers we should have. Right now, the calculator only gives you one answer, but that is not the only thing that is going to be the answer. So let me kind of explain to you square roots for a second. When we are taking the square root, the reason why the square root of 16 is 4 is because you're trying to find 2 of the exact same number that multiplies to get you 16. So that's why 4 times 4 multiplies to get you 16, and that's why the square root of 16 is 4. However, not only 2 positives multiply to get you a positive. Notice that -4 times -4 will also get you positive 16. So while the calculator only ever gives you the positive answer, you have to know that there is really a second answer. It's the exact same number, but it has to be a negative. So once again, because it is a square, we will have two answers, one of them being positive and one of them being negative. Another way you might see answers being written, instead of writing out both of those numbers, if you have a plus or minus sign in front and then you put that number, it tells you that you're dealing with both a positive 4 as well as a negative 4. I usually write my answer like that, but you can always break it up and give me the two separate answers with a comma in between them. Okay, but while your calculator only gives you one answer, you will always have two when you're solving an equation and taking the square root of both sides. So let's take a look at the next example. We have x squared equals the square root of 196. Once again, it's nice. We have that x squared term isolated by itself, which means I can just go ahead and take the square root on the left, which means I have to take the square root on the right. When I take the square root of a square, it leaves me then just with the x. Remember, I'm going to get in the habit right away. I want two answers, both a positive as well as a negative, because once again, that exponent of 2 tells me that when I'm solving, I have two answers. So once again, you can use your calculator or you can use the multiplication table. Remember, when you have the multiplication table, when you're looking at it, there were a whole bunch of highlighted numbers diagonally. Those are perfect square numbers, and that's because it's two of the exact same number that multiplies to get it to you. So use the calculator or use that multiplication table where you can look for the number diagonally, and we should see that my answer is going to be both positive as well as negative 14. Notice that in the next one, x squared equals 9. Same thing. The squared term is isolated by itself, which means we get to take the square root of both sides. That will leave you with just the x. I cannot forget that the exponent tells me that I have two answers, both a positive as well as a negative. You can plug that into your calculator. You can look at your multiplication table, or you can just think, what are two of the same number that multiply to get 9? And that answer would be 3. So both positive as well as negative 3 would be my answer. When I look at the next problem, I see that x squared equals negative 1. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And so once again, when I take the square root of a square, it is going to give me x by itself. But now I want to show you with the calculator here. When I take the square root and then I have negative 1, notice how my calculator tells me undefined. Or maybe in your calculator, it says error. Okay, I believe if I type that into a calculator, it says domain error. Okay, so there is a reason for this. Notice how this is the first time we have a number that is negative underneath the square root. So when that happens, you're going to get an error, whether it says domain error or it says undefined. We cannot have negative numbers under a square root. That will not give us a real number. So right now, when that occurs, our final answer, we're going to say no real solution. Okay. Because as you move up in the math world, we will have an answer for that, but it's something called an imaginary number. So right now, we're only dealing with real numbers, so there is no real solution when there's a negative number under the square root. So then I want to look at part E. We have x squared equals 0. Once again, this squared term is isolated by itself, which is exactly what I want, so I can take the square root of both sides. So then when I solve, I get x by itself. When I take the square root of 0, I'm going to get 0. Now here's the thing. It's technically plus or minus in front. However, there's no such thing as a positive 0 and a negative 0. So this is the only time where you can write the answer one time. However, know that technically there are two answers, but they're just both 0. And so because there's no such thing, like I said, as a positive 0 and a negative 0, you can just write 0. But technically, there are two answers. Okay? Then if I look at the next one, x squared equals 1. The square is isolated by itself, so I can take the square root of both sides. So then when I do, I get the x by itself. We can type that into our calculator, but once again, we do not want to forget that there are two answers here, both a positive as well as a negative. Square root of 1 is going to be 1, but it's both positive as well as negative, and that would be my answer. Okay, so then the next one is a checkpoint. So I want you to pause the video and see if you can solve x squared equals 121. So please pause the video and try that. Okay, so hopefully you pause the video, and then hopefully you notice that you should have gotten both a positive as well as a negative 11. This would be my answer.